We're going to get right to that breaking news this morning. Overnight and a dramatic weekend in Afghanistan, where the Taliban has taken control after seizing the capital, Kabul, unopposed following the government's collapse as President Ashraf Ghani fled the country. The fall of Kabul marks the final stage of a lightning campaign by the militant group, sweeping the nation in a matter of weeks, catching the U.S. off guard and forcing an urgent evacuation of embassy staff.
On Sunday, Secretary of State Antony Blinken defended the president's decision to pull out U.S. troops. Speaking on NBC's Meet the Press, Blinken blamed the Afghan military for the rapid Taliban takeover.
The inability of Afghan security forces to defend their country has played a very powerful role in what we've seen over the last few weeks. The fact is, we invested, the international community invested over 20 years, billions of dollars in these forces, 300,000 of them, with an air force, something the Taliban didn't have, with the most modern, sophisticated equipment. And unfortunately, tragically, they have not been able to defend the country. And I think that explains why this has moved as quickly as it's moved.
The State Department says the U.S. military is now in control of Kabul's airport, where embassy personnel are awaiting evacuation. But they're not the only ones trying to leave. Hundreds of Afghans flooded the civilian side of the airport, desperately trying to board planes out of the country. We have a team of reporters standing by to bring us more on all these events. NBC News correspondent Ali Arouzi is in Tehran. White House correspondent Mike Memoli is near Camp David, where the president is currently staying. And Capitol Hill correspondent Garrett Hake is also with us from Washington. Plus, we'll be joined shortly by retired Admiral James Stavridis. Let's start with Ali. He's in Tehran, monitoring the latest developments in the region. Ali, what is the latest at Kabul airport? How soon before we know all the embassy staff can get out of the country?
Hey, Joe. Well, there are scenes of panic and pandemonium at Kabul airport today as desperate people pour onto the runway trying to flee the country in what can only be described as a chaotic exodus. People are literally clinging onto U.S. military aircrafts as they try to take off. The U.S. is in charge of the airport, but their focus is on the evacuation of American personnel. As far as commercial flights go, it's a disorderly mess with little security around them. We know that as of last night, the U.S. military had flown around 500 embassy personnel out of the country on military aircraft. Now, they're working up to a capacity of several thousand out per day, but they won't have that capability for a few days yet. As for the Afghans that have worked on various roles for the U.S., it's going to be a much tougher way to get out. Commercial flights, as we can see, are already problematic. There are hundreds of them stranded at the airport with their suitcases and whatever other belongings they could muster. And just getting to the airport from a far-flung location in Afghanistan means having to run a very dangerous gauntlet across the country that could cost you your life. There are also unconfirmed reports that we can't confirm that 5 people have been killed at the airport under unclear circumstances. It could have been gunfire. It could have been a stampede. It's so chaotic there right now. The facts are still dripping out.
You know, Ali, last week, U.S. intelligence officials said it could be months before Kabul falls. In reality, it took much shorter than that, just one day to topple Kabul. How was the Taliban able to capture the capital and really the country so easily?
Well, Joe, there are many contributing factors that we could discuss and dissect for days to come, but ultimately it comes down to a tale of two armies. The Afghan army and security forces that until yesterday were about 300,000 strong, and the Taliban with about 75,000, 80,000 fighters. Now, despite being trained and equipped by the U.S. military, receiving intelligence and air support, the Afghan army didn't really have a fighting chance once the U.S. and NATO weren't propping them up, because they simply weren't as motivated as the Taliban, who were very motivated. They made up for their lack of equipment with huge doses of motivation and discipline, nor were the Afghan army willing to fight to the death as opposed to the Taliban, and that's why they were so easily able to take over a country of 38 million people.
And Ali, do we know what are the Taliban's plans now that they're in control of the country? What could the future look like for its people?
Well, a Taliban spokesman this morning said that the type of rule and form of the regime will be clear soon. He said that they will lay out a manifesto of what they're planning on how they're planning on running the country. But looking at their past record, it doesn't look very promising for the Afghan people. Look, the Taliban reigned over a tyrannical period in Afghanistan, some of its darkest period. They haven't shown much signs of changing their attitudes in the last 20 years. So we can expect a much more repressive regime again in Afghanistan, with social reforms rolled back, especially for women. I've spoken to several Afghan women this morning who are in Iran right now, and they said the country is going to be a prison for women once again, as it was 20 years ago. The big question also, Joe, is are the Taliban going to allow the country to be a breeding ground, a training ground for terrorists like Al-Qaeda in the past? If they do that, we may see more conflict with Afghanistan. If they keep a low profile, they'll probably stay in power for some time to come.
Ali Arouzi highlighting two of the biggest worries right now. Thank you for your reporting. Appreciate it, Ali.
Now, as the world watches the dramatic scene on the ground in Afghanistan, the Pentagon is now sending an additional 1,000 troops to Afghanistan. That decision now brings the total number of troops to 6,000 to assist with the evacuation of embassy personnel. President Biden is facing intense pushback for his administration's handling of the drawdown of troops, with hundreds of protesters gathering outside the White House Sunday afternoon. Let's now bring in our Washington team for more on the fallout. Mike, good morning. I know that you are actually near Camp David, where President Biden was this weekend on what was supposed to be somewhat of a vacation, but we have not heard much. What and when do we expect to hear from President Biden on this?
Well, certainly that is the question, Savannah. It's striking that we have not heard from President Biden on camera in nearly a week. It was last Tuesday that he left the White House for what comes as close as a president can ever get to a vacation over these past 2 weeks now. But what we have seen from the White House is a series of readouts of the president's ongoing briefings. We were told he's been briefed on a daily basis, multiple times a day, by his senior leadership team, also consulting with our allies. And we are hearing from the president in the form of a paper statement in which he says this: when I became president, I faced a choice: follow through on the deal with a brief extension to get our forces and our allies out safely, or ramp up our presence and send more American troops to fight once again in another country's civil conflict. And as we've heard from the president several times, he says, I was the fourth president to preside over an American troop presence in Afghanistan, and I will not pass this on to a fifth. White House officials are not ruling out the possibility that the president will leave Camp David, return to Washington to address the nation about developments here. But two big questions: when exactly will that happen? How quickly? And what will the president say? Certainly a lot of questions about how he's handled this drawdown.
Absolutely. Mike, stick with us. I've got another question for you in just a moment. Garrett, good morning. Let me bring you in here. President Biden has been getting heavy criticism. As I mentioned, there were those protests, but also from Republicans and even some Democrats there in D.C. What are they saying? And has he actually received any notable support?
Well, look, this conflict had been on the back burner for Congress for quite some time, and members, I think, were surprised at the speed at which things deteriorated here, and Republicans in particular were furious, castigating the president for making a decision to leave the country irrespective of conditions on the ground. Some of these lawmakers had been critical of former President Trump's plan to do the same thing. Others had said very little when this had happened, or when discussions of this issue had happened during the previous administration. But watching the pictures out of Kabul, particularly Republicans seized on the moment and pointed out that we were essentially leaving so many of our Afghan partners behind. Here's Republican Mike McCall, who's the ranking member of the Foreign Affairs Committee, discussing this on one of the Sunday shows over the weekend. Listen.
Since the decision was made in May, I think it's an unmitigated disaster of epic proportions. And I think the president, this is going to be a stain on this president and his presidency. And I think he's going to have blood on his hands for what they did.
Democrats didn't rush to defend Biden on the situation in Afghanistan, which I think speaks to the complicated politics here. Many of the statements that we did see were qualified in their criticism or in their viewpoint. Chris Murphy, for example, who's a fairly senior member on the Senate Foreign Affairs Committee put out a statement in which he focuses on the fact that what we need to see now is this orderly evacuation of Kabul, and that we need to make sure that both our embassy personnel and our allies in Afghanistan are safely removed from the country. Only then, he argues, can we really judge the success or failure of this. But Murphy makes the point, as did several other Democrats, that leaving Afghanistan was always going to be the right thing to do, and that there was never going to be a good time to do it. So the statements from Democrats defending the president, I think, are trying to look hopefully a little bit over the horizon to see what this all looks like in perhaps several days or a week or so after what they hope will be a fairly orderly drawdown of Americans and allies is completed.
Garrett, the lower third there, the banner across the bottom of that soundbite that you just played for us there actually tees me up very well for this next question for Mike, which is just about exactly how quickly this has happened and what the reaction there is, the White House. I mean, that was just yesterday morning, you said, on a Sunday show. And the lower third there said that the Taliban was at the gates of Kabul. Of course, we know in just less than 24 hours that situation has dramatically changed for the worse. So, Mike, what is the reaction of the White House? We know we haven't heard from President Biden, but, you know, he's said in the past, he's stressed, you mentioned it, that the future of this country is up to its citizens and really the Afghan military. We saw, though, how quickly this happened. What's the White House's reaction to that?
Yeah, Savannah, it was 4 months ago, almost exactly, that the president delivered his address outlining his plans to follow through on the President Trump decision to remove U.S. forces from Afghanistan. And he addressed it again just last month. And in both speeches, he underscored the sophistication of the training, the equipment that we've been giving to the Afghan national forces over 20 years of our involvement there. And the word from the White House at this point about why this happened so quickly is essentially this. We spent 20 years giving them the most sophisticated equipment, the best training in the world. But what we couldn't give them was the will to fight for their country. And that's what we're seeing play out, where in so many of these cities, the Taliban has entered without much of a fight. And given the undercurrent of the weakness of the Afghan government throughout this process, there was little, even in the worst case scenarios that were outlined to this administration, that predicated it being this fast. Now the question is, does the president follow through on the full withdrawal, or is there going to need to be a consistent stabilization of the airport, for instance, as we're seeing now, for the foreseeable future?
And I think that what we just heard from our colleague Ali Arouzi there, the fact that we had the numbers and the equipment was given to the Afghan military, and yet that's what we're seeing. Mike and Garrett, thank you so much for joining us on this big morning.
For more on this developing situation, let's bring in NBC News Chief International Security and Diplomacy Analyst, retired Admiral James Stavridis. He's also the former Supreme Allied Commander at NATO. Admiral, good to have you with us. So President Biden and his top officials had said the Afghan military would be able to handle the Taliban, they thought. He also said the situation would not be like the U.S. exit from Vietnam at the end of that war, the fall of Saigon. Here's just some of what he said last month.
The Taliban is not the North Vietnamese army. They're not remotely comparable in terms of capability. There's going to be no circumstance where you see people being lifted off the roof of an embassy of the United States from Afghanistan. It is not at all comparable.
And yet we saw the images of helicopters hovering over the embassy unfolding on live TV yesterday. I mean, in your mind, was there a way that this situation, the rapid takeover by the Taliban, the quick evacuation by the U.S., could it have been avoided?
Well, first of all, is this a Saigon moment? You know, I'm old enough to actually remember Saigon. 1975, I was a midshipman at the U.S. Naval Academy. And unfortunately, this is very much like Saigon. In fact, it's worse than Saigon in the sense that it's happened so quickly. Could it have been prevented? I don't think so, given what we now know about the rotten core inside the Afghan security forces, which we did not see coming. So overall, I think it could have been handled better by keeping forces longer in place. But once the administration made the decision to pull everybody out by August 31st, I think that was like waving a red flag in front of the Taliban. They moved out, and unpredictably, from our perspective, the Afghan security forces collapsed. Pretty hard to wind that clock back in any other way.
Talking about what we could have maybe predicted, our colleagues Ken Delaney and Courtney Cubie are now reporting that U.S. intelligence officials are denying there was an intelligence failure to anticipate the collapse of the Afghan government. But two sources tell NBC News This is going worse than even the worst case scenario they saw in intelligence assessments, which was that the Taliban could take Kabul by September 11th. It's now August 16th. So in your mind, I mean, how much of this was an intelligence failure? How much of it was just, military leadership and planning?
I think there is plenty of blame to go around here, starting with the lack of imagination. In other words, we often say about 9/11 itself, the terrorist attack that precipitated us going to Afghanistan was not only a failure of intelligence, certainly there's a portion of that, but a failure of imagination. You've got to be able to push beyond the boundaries of what you conventionally think. And I, for one, and many others who have been observing this for a long time, I commanded this mission for 4 years, about a decade ago, could not have imagined this sudden collapse. So certainly there's an intelligence component to this. There's also a failure by the U.S. military, active duty military, including me, to train the Afghan security forces right. There's a failure of policy in that the administration pulled out too precipitously. There's a failure on the part of the Afghan government, as we've talked about. So I think there's plenty of failure to go around. We need to analyze it, study it, learn from it. We've made mistakes here. Let's not repeat them.
Admiral Stavridis, we thank you for your candor and for your expertise this morning. Thanks so much.
In just 8 days, the Taliban have seized control of a majority of Afghanistan's cities and towns after 20 years of war, 4 U.S. presidents, and more than 2,400 American lives lost. Veterans wonder what it was all for. NBC News correspondent Megan Fitzgerald has more.
More than 2,400 flag-draped coffins returned home from Afghanistan. The nation honoring our heroes who sacrificed it all in America's longest war, starting in 2001 when the World Trade Towers were attacked.
We will stay until the mission is done.
The mission to defeat al-Qaeda and kill its leader, Osama bin Laden, ultimately accomplished, driving out the Taliban and building an Afghan government that can survive on its own.
We will stand with you as you defend your new democracy.
It was a commitment lasting 20 years, costing the U.S. more than $2 trillion.
Americans' commitment to you and to a secure, stable, and unified Afghanistan, that remains firm.
Afghans will secure and build their own nation and define their own future.
We have trained and equipped a standing force of over 300,000 Afghan personnel today.
More than 600,000 troops deployed multiple times, working to train the Afghan army as American military leaders promised they would one day be ready.
The bulk of this country today is permissive, it's secure.
We are building Afghan security forces that are on track to take the lead for securing the entire country.
They have capable ground, air, and special operations forces.
But only weeks after most U.S. troops pulled out of the country, defeat.
How do you feel about what's happening in Afghanistan right now?
I'm brokenhearted about it. I hate to think that everything we did out there was in vain.
Denise Giannette's son was a medic who served 4 years in Afghanistan and was killed on the front lines. Her son and his comrades will always be heroes. They fought to help a country that was unable to help themselves. Megan Fitzgerald, NBC News.
The Taliban takeover of the Afghan presidential palace all but solidifies their control over the country.
Yes, and now Afghans worry the lives they built over the last 20 years will be dismantled. Women, especially, were given entirely new opportunities and new hope. A new piece on NBCnews.com puts it this way. Journalists, intellectuals, activists, and prominent women, those who may have believed that Afghanistan could in some small way model a Western democracy, are in mortal danger.
Joining us now is the author of that piece, NBC News senior reporter Brinley Bruton. Brinley, thanks so much for joining us. You're reporting not only on the women in Kabul, but also what your friends are experiencing. I know you're in touch with some of those friends. What is the situation like for them now? Do they know what they're going to do next?
Mostly they don't know what they're going to do next. Those who are trying to get out of the country, you've seen the scenes from the airport, are stuck. There are other people who don't know whether to even go to work. A woman I know works as a journalist, and she just feels that, you know, if she goes to work, she could be targeted on her way to work. She could be targeted at work. The Taliban could raid the newsroom, which it's done. A man I know, you know, he gets multiple calls from his wife every day. She wants to know if he's alive. His sons ask him, you know, are you going to come back alive? So people don't know what to do. They can't get money out of ATMs. There's no government. There's nothing there. Those people who supported the Western supported government don't know who to turn to even. The Americans are leaving. Everyone else in the coalition is leaving.
And Brindley, your piece highlights, you know, so much of what we've been talking about this morning, which were these promises made, and then, of course, so much money spent by the U.S. And now we ultimately know that in just a matter of days, really, the Taliban has taken over the country again. We've heard President Biden say, we've heard presidents before him say that we can't stay in the country indefinitely. But what would the people on the ground that you're speaking to, your friends, the people who are scared, frankly, as you're saying, what would they want?
Well, to be honest, some Afghans have been critical of the American-backed government for a long time. So what they would have wanted, what they say they want, is support in forcing the government to do a better job. I worked with journalists there, and they've been breaking stories on inefficiency, corruption, injustice. So they were hoping that, you know, the world's remaining superpower would support them in their fight for that. These are people who took on board the message that democracy and a well-run government is the best, is the way to go. And so they're not blind to the problems in Afghanistan. On the contrary, they wanted help, or the people I know want help resolving these issues. And they see the Americans and other Western countries as a big problem. It's a big part of the problem because it's, you know, one of the things that enabled corruption, these huge amounts of money that went into Afghanistan. Not that they're being ungrateful, but they see politicians becoming extremely rich. And, you know, on average, Afghans, recent statistics show that poverty rates have gone up. So they wanted support to attain that sort of democratic ideal, if you see what I mean. I don't think they envisioned an American occupation forever.
All right. Brindley Bruton, thank you so much for your reporting. Please check out our piece at NBCnews.com. Thank you.
Thank you. The United States isn't the only country evacuating embassy personnel. Others around the world are reducing their diplomatic footprint in the wake of the Taliban takeover. In the UK, Prime Minister Boris Johnson called for a joint response to the events in Afghanistan.
We don't want anybody bilaterally recognizing the Taliban. We want a united position amongst all the like-minded as far as we can get one, so that we do whatever we can to prevent Afghanistan lapsing back into being a breeding ground for terror.
NBC News foreign correspondent Molly Hunter joins us now from London. Molly, good morning. So the UK has, of course, been a major partner to the U.S. during this war in Afghanistan. So first, just tell us, what's the reaction been like there to what we've seen play out over the last few days, and what are the government's plans?
Hey, guys, good morning. Right. They've been a big partner. They've been as involved as the U.S., and certainly their priorities, their reactions this morning are very similar to the U.S. So they are trying to get their personnel out, and they are trying to get Afghans who worked with the U.K. government, military, and civil society, and, of course, in their embassy out as well. Now, the U.K. defense minister spoke this morning. He said they're aiming for about 4,000 people by the end of the month. Not as quickly as he hoped. He said some people will be left behind, and he says the delays in actually getting people out apparently are going to be up to actually processing all of that paperwork, not actually capacity on those planes. Now, Prime Minister Boris Johnson, you just heard, he called for a unified response. He's also called Parliament back from summer vacation for an emergency session on Wednesday, and I think we're going to hear a lot more from the UK government, of course, in the next 2 days.
Molly, let's now also turn to America's rivals. So China and Russia are among those that are actually keeping their embassies open. Do we have any indication what that means their plans are in Afghanistan under Taliban rule?
Yeah, Savannah, at least keeping their embassies open for now. So our colleague Janice Mackey-Freyer reports that the Chinese Foreign Ministry says it's willing to forge what they call a friendly relationship with the Taliban in Afghanistan. Now, Janice followed up to ask if that meant recognition of the Taliban as the legitimate government. She didn't get a clear answer. As for Russia, Russia says they are in contact with the Taliban. They are keeping their embassy open. They say they are certainly going to send some people at least on a summer vacation, but they're not calling it an evacuation. We'll certainly keep our eye on both of those in coming days.
Yes, definitely. Molly, thank you so much.